There are moments in history when the official version hides more than it reveals. Decisions that appear sudden, inexplicable, or even reckless often have roots buried deep in private conversations, confidential letters, and warnings never meant for public eyes. Today's story takes us behind one of those moments. It is a real historical account, reconstructed from private correspondence, political pressure, and personal fear at the highest level of Allied command during the Second World War. Before this continues, write a comment sharing what you already know about George Patton or Winston Churchill, because what follows may challenge everything you thought you understood. Inside the chaos of global war, reputations were fragile, power was contested, and even legendary generals were never truly safe. George Patton was not just a battlefield commander, he was a symbol. To some, he embodied discipline, speed, and decisive action. To others, he was unpredictable, politically dangerous, and capable of saying things that could fracture alliances. Winston Churchill knew this better than almost anyone. What most people never see is how deeply concerned Churchill became about Patton's words, his temperament, and the political consequences that might follow if those words reached the wrong ears. Right after this introduction, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments as this story unfolds. Your engagement helps bring hidden history like this to light. By the time Allied forces were advancing through Europe, Patton had already built a reputation that worried politicians as much as it inspired soldiers. His private remarks about the Soviet Union, his blunt criticism of Allied strategy, and his inability to soften his language in front of journalists or fellow officers placed him under constant scrutiny. Official reports rarely mention how frequently London and Washington discussed whether Patton was more liability than asset. Yet in Churchill's private letters, a different tone emerges. These were not casual notes, they were urgent warnings. Churchill understood that the war was not only fought with tanks and troops, but with fragile alliances. The Soviet Union was an essential partner, and any hint of internal division among Western commanders could be exploited. In private correspondence, Churchill expressed fear that Patton's outspoken nature could damage diplomatic relations at a critical moment. He worried that Patton's statements, if amplified, might suggest future conflict between allies before the war was even won. These concerns were not theoretical. Intelligence services monitored morale, rumors, and even informal conversations, knowing that perception could be as powerful as military force. What makes these letters extraordinary is the balance Churchill tried to strike. He admired Patton's effectiveness on the battlefield. He recognized that few commanders could move an army as fast or inspire such fierce loyalty. At the same time, he questioned whether Patton could be controlled. In several letters, Churchill hinted that allowing Patton to continue unchecked might force political leaders into a decision they wanted to avoid. Removal, reassignment, or public reprimand were all quietly discussed possibilities, even while Patton continued to push forward across Europe. Meanwhile, Patton himself seemed largely unaware of how close he was to professional disaster. His confidence bordered on certainty that results would protect him. Victories, he believed, outweighed words. What he did not see was that Churchill's concern was not about military failure, but about political catastrophe. In a war where unity was carefully staged and constantly reinforced, one powerful voice going off script could unravel months of diplomatic effort. The private letters reveal a man under immense pressure. Churchill was not simply reacting to Patton. He was anticipating reactions from allies, from Parliament, from the press, and from history itself. Removing Patton outright could damage morale and suggest weakness. Keeping him risked something far worse. These were the calculations unfolding quietly, while battles raged loudly across the continent. As these warnings circulated among a small circle of leaders, the question became unavoidable. How close did Patton come to being removed, and what exactly stopped it from happening at that moment? The answer lies not in a single incident, but in a chain of events, shifting priorities, and one crucial decision that changed everything. The pressure surrounding Patton intensified as the war moved into its final and most politically sensitive phase. Churchill's private letters show that concern had evolved into something closer to alarm. Reports reached London describing Patton's comments about the post-war world, especially his belief that conflict with the Soviet Union was inevitable. In a time when Allied unity was presented as unbreakable, such ideas were explosive. Churchill feared that if these views became public, they could be interpreted as an unofficial declaration of future hostility, undermining negotiations already taking place behind closed doors. Within the Allied command structure, conversations about Patton became increasingly cautious. Official memoranda were carefully worded, but private correspondence was more direct. Churchill warned that Patton's continued prominence might provoke diplomatic fallout that could not be undone. He emphasized that the war's end would be judged not only by victory, but by how stable the peace appeared in its earliest moments. A general openly questioning the alliance risked casting doubt on everything the leaders claimed to stand for. At the same time, Churchill was acutely aware of Patton's value. Battlefield reports confirmed that Patton's aggressive tactics were shortening campaigns and saving lives, at least in the short term. Soldiers trusted him. Officers followed him without hesitation. Removing such a figure during active operations carried enormous risk. Churchill's letters reflect this tension clearly. He described Patton as both indispensable and dangerous, a combination that left no easy solution. American leadership was also divided. Some officials believed Patton's statements could be managed, softened, or ignored as long as military success continued. Others shared Churchill's fears and worried that Patton's words revealed a mindset incompatible with post-war diplomacy. These disagreements played out quietly through cables, meetings, and confidential exchanges that never reached the public. To the outside world, Patton remained a celebrated commander. Inside leadership circles, his future was being debated line by line. One particularly revealing aspect of Churchill's correspondence is his concern about timing. He did not want Patton removed in a way that appeared reactive or punitive. Such an action, he believed, could suggest internal conflict and weaken Allied credibility. Instead, Churchill considered whether Patton could be repositioned, limited in exposure, or guided through intermediaries who might temper his public presence. The goal was not to silence him entirely, but to contain the risk he represented. Patton, however, continued to speak with the same blunt confidence that had defined his career. He believed history favored strength and clarity, not cautious diplomacy. This difference in worldview placed him on a collision course with political leaders who saw ambiguity and restraint as tools of survival. The more Patton spoke about the future, the more Churchill worried about the present. As victory in Europe drew closer, the stakes increased. The transition from war to peace would be scrutinized by allies and adversaries alike. Churchill's letters suggest that he feared a single misstep could alter how the world perceived Allied intentions. Patton's reputation, once a shield, was beginning to look like a liability that could not be ignored indefinitely. Yet despite the warnings, no immediate action was taken. Something held the decision back. Whether it was Patton's continued success, shifting priorities, or an unexpected development that redirected attention, the moment of removal was delayed. Understanding why requires examining a critical turning point that reshaped the entire discussion and pushed Patton's fate into uncertain territory. That turning point arrived in a way few expected, not through another statement from Patton, but through the rapid collapse of Germany and the sudden shift in global priorities. As the war in Europe ended, attention moved almost overnight from battlefield momentum to political positioning. Churchill's letters reveal that the danger he feared had changed shape. It was no longer about Patton undermining unity during active combat. It was about how figures like Patton might influence the fragile transition into a new world order. Behind closed doors, Allied leaders were already thinking about borders, influence, and the balance of power that would follow victory. Patton's earlier comments about the Soviet Union, once considered reckless, now sounded to some like uncomfortable foresight. This complicated Churchill's position even further. Removing Patton too late might suggest that the Allies were silencing dissent, just as new tensions became impossible to ignore. Keeping him, however, risked legitimizing views that contradicted official diplomatic messaging. Churchill's private correspondence from this period shows a noticeable shift in tone. Instead of urging immediate restraint, he began emphasizing management and distance. Patton was increasingly kept away from high-profile political moments. His access to the press was reduced, and his role was subtly reframed. None of this was announced. To the public, Patton remained a victorious general. In reality, he was being carefully placed outside the center of political gravity. At the same time, new incidents added weight to earlier concerns. Patton's comments about former German officials and post-war administration alarmed both American and British leadership. Churchill viewed these remarks as confirmation that Patton could not easily adapt to the moral and political complexity of occupation and reconstruction. Winning the war required aggression, winning the peace required restraint. Patton excelled at one and struggled with the other. Despite this, Churchill resisted a dramatic removal. His letters suggest that he feared creating a martyr or a symbol of suppressed truth. Patton's popularity among troops and the public meant that any harsh action could backfire. Questions would be asked, motives would be scrutinized. In a world already dividing along ideological lines, Churchill did not want to provide ammunition to critics on either side. Instead, a quieter solution took shape. Patton's command was adjusted, his influence narrowed without confrontation. This approach allowed leaders to avoid a public crisis while achieving the same practical result. Patton was no longer positioned to shape policy or narrative. He remained visible enough to preserve morale, but distant enough to reduce risk. What the letters make clear is that this outcome was not inevitable. At several moments, Churchill believed removal was still possible, even necessary. Each time, broader events intervened. New diplomatic pressures emerged. Conferences were planned. Alliances were renegotiated. In that shifting landscape, Patton became less central, and the urgency surrounding him slowly faded, yet the tension never fully disappeared. Churchill understood that Patton represented a type of thinking that would not vanish with the end of the war. The private letters hint at a deeper concern, that Patton was not an exception, but a sign of conflicts yet to come. This realization influenced how Churchill viewed the future and how he prepared for it. As the world stepped into the uncertain aftermath of victory, Patton's near removal remained unresolved in public memory, but firmly documented in private ink. To understand what this meant for Churchill himself and how these decisions echoed beyond Patton's career, we must look at the final consequences that followed. The consequences of these decisions extended far beyond Patton's personal career. Churchill's private letters reveal that the restraint shown toward Patton was part of a broader strategy, one shaped by exhaustion, uncertainty, and the fear of misjudging the post-war moment. Churchill knew that the authority he wielded during the war would not remain unquestioned forever. The political landscape at home was changing, and public tolerance for secrecy and unilateral decisions was beginning to erode. As occupation policies took form, Patton's discomfort with political oversight became more visible. He expressed frustration with restrictions placed on military authority and showed little patience for the slow process of rebuilding civilian governance. Churchill interpreted this as further evidence that Patton belonged to a phase of history that was already ending. The qualities that made him invaluable in combat now risked becoming obstacles in peace. Churchill's letters during this period also reflect a growing awareness of his own vulnerability. Elections loomed. Public opinion mattered more than ever. Any controversy involving Patton could quickly become entangled with domestic politics, both in Britain and in the United States. A single headline suggesting internal division among Allied leaders could weaken Churchill's standing at a moment when stability was desperately needed. Rather than forcing a confrontation, Churchill allowed time to do the work that politics could not. Patton's reduced role became normalized. The absence of dramatic action made the transition appear natural, even inevitable. Over time, public attention shifted elsewhere, and the urgency that once surrounded Patton's words faded from headlines. What remains striking in the letters is the absence of triumph. Churchill did not celebrate avoiding Patton's removal. He viewed it as a compromise, not a victory. In several passages, he expressed unease about the precedent being set. If strong personalities had to be quietly sidelined to preserve unity, what did that say about the strength of the alliance itself? This question lingered in his writing long after the immediate crisis passed. Patton, for his part, never fully accepted the limits placed upon him. He continued to see himself as a warrior in a world that no longer wanted warriors in the same way. This disconnect deepened his sense of isolation and frustration. Churchill seemed to recognize this tragedy. His letters carry a tone of reluctant sympathy, acknowledging that Patton's struggle was not solely personal, but historical. As the early signs of the Cold War emerged, Churchill's earlier fears took on new meaning. The divisions Patton spoke about, once dismissed as dangerous speculation, became visible realities. Yet Churchill never publicly revisited the decisions made during those critical months. The letters remained private, preserving a record of doubt, caution, and compromise. These documents show that leadership during transition is often defined by what is avoided rather than what is done. Patton's near removal was not the result of a single misstep, but of an environment where every word carried disproportionate weight. Churchill chose silence and subtlety over confrontation, believing it was the least damaging option available. The final impact of this choice becomes clear only when we examine how history remembers both men, and how those private warnings contrast with the public narratives that followed. When history finally closed the chapter on George Patton and Winston Churchill, it did so with public images that only partially reflected the truth. Patton is remembered as a brilliant, aggressive commander, larger than life, fearless and uncompromising. Churchill is remembered as the steady voice of resistance and resolve. What the private letters reveal is how fragile that reality truly was, and how close both men came to being defined by a decision never publicly acknowledged. For Patton, the near removal marked the invisible boundary of his influence. He remained a general, but no longer a shaping force. His ideas about the post-war world were effectively excluded from official strategy, even as events slowly moved in directions that echoed his earlier warnings. The silence imposed around him ensured stability in the short term, but it also ensured that his perspective would be dismissed as excess rather than examined as insight. Churchill, on the other hand, carried the weight of the decision quietly. The letters show no satisfaction, only a lingering awareness that leadership often demands restraint that history rarely rewards. He understood that keeping Patton in check helped preserve Allied unity during a delicate transition, yet he also sensed that suppressing strong voices could carry long-term consequences. This contradiction followed Churchill into the post-war years, especially as the divisions he feared became impossible to ignore. As the Cold War emerged, Patton's reputation underwent a subtle transformation. Statements once labeled dangerous began to sound prophetic to later generations, yet by then, Patton was no longer alive to defend or refine his views. The opportunity for open debate had passed. What remained were fragments of speech, second-hand accounts, and the private warnings preserved in ink by a cautious Prime Minister. Churchill's letters stand today as a rare window into the emotional and political burden of command. They show a leader balancing loyalty, fear, admiration, and responsibility in a moment when the future was deeply uncertain. The near removal of Patton was not an act of cowardice or control, but an attempt to prevent fracture at the exact moment unity was most fragile. This story reminds us that history is not only shaped by battles and speeches, but by decisions never announced and actions deliberately avoided. The distance between what the public sees and what leaders fear can be vast. Patton's career did not end in disgrace, yet it was quietly redirected. Churchill's leadership did not falter, yet it was marked by doubt that few ever saw. In the end, the warnings behind Patton's near removal were not about one man's words, but about the limits of power in a world on the brink of transformation. They reveal how victory can create dangers as real as defeat, and how leaders must sometimes choose silence over certainty. Understanding this hidden struggle allows us to see the Second World War not as a clean narrative of heroes and villains, but as a human story shaped by hesitation, restraint, and unresolved tension. If this hidden chapter of history added something new to your understanding, leave a comment sharing your thoughts and let others know what surprised you most.